Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of St James Ethics Centre and the Wheeler Centre, who present these debates, with the support of The Age, the City of Melbourne and AMP, I'd like to welcome you here tonight to the Melbourne Town Hall for the third debate in the 2012 series of Intelligence Squared debates. Tonight we are gathered on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation. I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners and, on behalf of all of us, pay our respects to their elders and to the elders of other communities who may be here today. My name is Simon Longstaff. I'm the Executive Director of St James Ethics Centre, and it's my pleasure this evening to chair the debate. I should mention, given that this debate involves you in the audience participating, that the proceedings are being recorded tonight for ABC Big Ideas by Slow TV and the Wheeler Centre, and you'll see them being subsequently broadcast or downloaded from the websites of both the Wheeler Centre, probably the ABC and St James Ethics Centre. And if you happen to be a tweeter in the audience, and usually there are a few these days, then you can engage in live tweeting. The hashtag is #IQ2OZ, #IQ2Oz. And to all of you, I extend a very hearty welcome. There are some basic rules for the debate. If you've read the order paper, you'll know the general structure of it. Each of the speakers on the stage will speak for up to 9 minutes. We'll then have a floor debate, which is an opportunity for you to speak for the motion or against the motion, or perhaps to ask a question or to make a comment. The one thing that these debates all have in common is that whilst we encourage passionate disagreement, we also ask you to disagree with each other respectfully. It's true for the speakers on the stage and also for those of you in the audience who might wish to speak later on. You will have found on your seats the voting tickets. Hopefully when you were entering the hall earlier tonight, you were polled and asked your opinion, whether you were for the motion, against the motion or undecided, without having heard a single argument. Later on tonight, you'll be asked to cast a formal ballot. If you are still undecided, then just leave the voting ticket joined together. Otherwise, tear it in half and you can cast for or against according to your opinion. And then we'll get the results later on. The topic is that foreign aid is a waste of money, and we've got 6 wonderful speakers to address that topic tonight. So let me introduce them. You've got a bit of information about them on the order papers, but I'll flesh it out now. And I'd ask that we'll welcome all people on the affirmative and the negative as a group after I've introduced each side. Speaking first for the affirmative is Greg Sheridan, the Australian's foreign editor, and truly he's one of the most influential foreign affairs analysts in Australian journalism. After 25 years in the field, he's a veteran of international affairs and he's interviewed leaders all over the Asia Pacific and America. He began his career in journalism in the late 1970s at the Bulletin magazine. He's had a lifelong love affair with Asia, knows its leaders and societies intimately, having interviewed presidents and prime ministers in Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, Thailand, New Zealand, and I have to say numerous other countries. And his area of interest goes well beyond just the Asia Pacific. His works appeared in the newspapers around the world, including the Sunday Times of London, the Asian Wall Street Journal, the Jakarta Post and the South China Morning Post. He is a frequent foreign affairs commentator on radio and television and a sought-after speaker at conferences around the world. He's joined by James Goodman, who's been on the management committee of the aid monitoring group AidWatch since 1999. He's campaigned and researched on global justice issues since the mid-1990s and is co-author of a new book on the policy ideas of the global justice movement. James played a central role in the AidWatch High Court case, absolutely critical case that in 2010 established the constitutional right for charities to be political and to criticise government policy. He's an Associate Professor in the Social and Political Change Group at the University of Technology, Sydney. Co-author of Justice Globalism, Ideology, Crises, Policy, which is forthcoming with SAGE, and co-editor of Crisis Movement Management, Globalising Dynamics, also forthcoming, but this time with Routledge. He's edited several books on the politics of globalisation. And last but not least, speaking for the Affirmative, is one of Australia's growing in his reputation as a public intellectual, Tim Wilson, an international public policy analyst and commentator. He's currently Director of the Intellectual Property and Free Trade Unit at the Institute of Public Affairs, the world's oldest free market think tank. Tim also serves on the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's IP Industry Consultative Group, as well as being a Senior Fellow at New York Centre for Medicine in the Public Interest. He regularly appears on Australian and international television programs such as ABC One's Q&A, where he stays healthy, The Drum, Sky News, The Nation, radio on 3AW and ABC 774, and in the print media, particularly in The Australian. He currently hosts the Talking Policy segment on 3AW. Would you please welcome all of the speakers for the Affirmative. Speaking against the motion, led off by Martin Thomas, who is the Head of Public Affairs and External Relations at World Vision Australia. He's worked in the aid and development sector for more than a decade, both for World Vision and UNICEF in Australia and overseas. The senior roles Martin has held during this time include Director of Advocacy and Communications with UNICEF Australia, Head of Advocacy and Chief of Staff to the CEO, World Vision Australia, Manager, Public Policy Communications for World Vision International, based in London. Prior to entering the NGO sector, Martin worked as a senior journalist and editor for News Limited publications, including for The Australian, the Courier Mail, where he held a number of roles, including as business editor, Chief of Staff and Senior Political Writer in New South Wales. Martin has a degree in theology and is completing his Master of International Relations. He is joined by Samar Hadid, the National Director of the Global Poverty Project. She's campaigned widely on social justice and women's rights issues. Samar was selected as the 2010 Australian Youth Representative to the United Nations and completed a fellowship with the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Her advisory roles have included Youth Representative on the Australian National Commission for UNESCO, a member of Amnesty International's Diversity Steering Committee, and a member of the UN Expert Meeting Group on Youth. She's been listed as one of the 50 women we must admire by the Herald Sun and voted as one of the top 100 leaders of tomorrow by the St Gallen Institute. And finally, Andrew Hewitt, Executive Director of Oxfam Australia. Andrew's previous positions with Oxfam include leadership of the agency's advocacy program and the direction of Oxfam International's response to the crisis in East Timor from 1999 to 2001. Andrew has extensive international advocacy experience. He was a member of the World Bank NGO Committee for 4 years and has participated in and observed numerous international conferences, including those of the World Trade Organisation and the World Bank. He's the Vice President of the Australian Council for International Development, ACFID, which is the peak council for non-government development agencies. He's also co-chair of the Make Poverty History campaign and a former member of BHP Billiton's Forum on Corporate Responsibility. He has visited Oxfam Australia programs in East Asia, South Asia, the Pacific and Central America, Southern Africa and the Horn of Africa, as well as its programs working with Indigenous Australians. In other words, he's seen it all on the ground. Would you please welcome the members of the Negative. Ladies and gentlemen, the proposition before this House is that foreign aid is a waste of money. I now invite Greg Sheridan to address this House with his arguments for the Affirmative. Greg Sheridan.
Simon, ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you a man in desperate need of aid, foreign or domestic, for I fear I am destined to lose this debate tonight. It's, after all, an unpopular proposition to be against aid. Looking out before me, see an audience of distinguished intellectuals and am reminded of Adlai Stevenson, who found himself in a similar situation and said, for the next 8 or 9 minutes, it's my job to talk, it's your job to listen. If you should finish your job before I finish my job, absolutely no hard feelings. And finally, to those of you who might disagree with what I'm about to say or perhaps find my remarks a bit captious and unobliging, I can only respond in the spirit of Abraham Lincoln, to his critics, you may be right. Now, the first proposition I want to put before you is that aid needs scrutiny. It needs outside scrutiny. So I'd like to congratulate Simon and the Wheeler Centre for holding this debate tonight, because the aid debate is dominated by people who are within the aid industry, and they all have an interest in promoting aid. Having said that, I'm not accusing them of bad will. I accept that the vast majority of people who go into foreign aid, either in an amateur or a professional fashion, are motivated out of altruism and a desire to better the lot of humanity. But I would also ask you to extend the same sense of goodwill to those critics of aid who think that it is ineffective and indeed a waste of money. We are not all heartless brutes desiring an increase in human suffering. Some of us just think there might be much more effective ways to spend the odd $5 billion or $5 trillion. Now, tonight, in my brief remarks, I'm not going to offer you a lot of statistics. It's not my style. You wouldn't remember them anyway, and I'd probably get them wrong. But anyone who is interested in a statistical analysis of the folly of aid should read William Easterly's masterful book, The White Man's Burden, which I endorse almost in its entirety. Instead, I want to offer just some reflections and perhaps ambitiously some insights from about 35 years, that bio which Simon so kindly read is about 10 years out of date, about 35 years of international journalism, much of it in developing countries in Southeast Asia, South Asia, North Asia and the Middle East. And first I want to register a caveat. I do support aid, foreign government aid, in all sorts of particular circumstances, where there's a natural disaster or a society trying to recover from conflict, civil or international conflict. Certainly I was very proud of the government aid which our Navy rendered to Indonesia in the wake of the tsunami on Boxing Day 2004. But what is aid for? What is its purpose? Its ostensible or declared purpose mostly is to eradicate poverty. But I must say my conclusion after 35 years in the field is that aid is next to useless in combating poverty and infinitely less effective than foreign investment or free trade. Bob Zellick, the recently retiring president of the World Bank, who I interviewed a week or two ago, referred me to a speech of his recently, Beyond Aid, in which he compared the flows of aid to the flows of foreign investment, and they are as nothing, and they are as of no consequence in economic development. Let me offer, though, a few specific examples from my life as a journalist. There used to be an annual meeting of aid donors for Indonesia, which took place sometimes in Europe, sometimes in Indonesia. One time I had a marvellous source inside the meeting who told me it began by the Dutch representative saying, well, this is the meeting where we decide how the poor people of my country will subsidise the rich people of Indonesia. Because, of course, aid comes from tax, which always rests most heavily on the poor. After all, if you're unemployed, you probably smoke, you pay GST on your cigs, you probably have a beer, you pay GST on that. If you're rich, you probably grow your own wine in the Yarra Valley and it's an income tax deduction. So those poor old unemployed taxpayers in Holland and Australia were giving billions of dollars to Indonesia, and Indonesia is a society I love next to no other, second to none. But it was then and is now one of the most corrupt societies in the world, and the vast quantity of that aid, of course, went to rich, corrupt Indonesians. There was recently a congressional report on the effectiveness of United States aid in Afghanistan. It found that a vast proportion of this aid went directly to the Taliban, because the aid agencies, quite understandably, had to provide security. There weren't enough soldiers to provide security because we tried to do these wars on the cheap. How could you provide security? You could pay the Taliban to stop attacking you. So a huge amount of money from the American taxpayer went to subsidise the Taliban and their opium growing efforts, in order that the poor old aid workers, who are very brave and good people, could be unmolested to carry out their aid projects. The other consequence of American aid in Afghanistan was that it paid much better salaries than the Afghan government, so it stripped all of the Afghan government of competent civil servants who all went to work for aid agencies, delivering unsustainable and ineffective aid projects which would be wiped away as soon as the Western coalition leaves. Consider China. China has international currency reserves of about $3.5 trillion US dollars. Yes, trillion with a T, trillion. That's 1,000 billion. 3,500 billion US dollars, which it decides for perfectly plausible macroeconomic reasons not to spend on domestic consumption, that is to say, on the benefit of its own people. But Australia, the Australian taxpayer, still gives aid every year to the government of China. Now, there's a technical term for this. It's called barking mad. And I can see no reason for it except the inertia that something was done in the past. There is a massive imbalance within our foreign affairs and trade budget. We spend about $800 million on our diplomatic network and $5.2 billion on foreign aid, and it's going up automatically each year because it's pegged to a target, which is all about trying to buy votes for our United Nations Security Council bid. Spectacular waste of money. Almost anything that the United Nations says or does is a lie, including and the and but, and you can only damage yourself by association with it. We will soon be giving aid to countries where we cannot afford to have an ambassador. That too falls into that technical category of barking mad. Free trade, opening our markets to poor countries, these will do much more good than providing aid in making those countries develop and reduce poverty. Australia gives a lot of aid which is offensive to Australian taxpayers. We give aid to a group called the Palestinian Agricultural Works Committee. Many members of its board until recently were people who had formerly held senior positions in the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, one of the key progenitors of 1970s terrorism, murdering civilians, blowing up aeroplanes and so on. I do understand it's hard to work in the Palestinian territories and not rub up against people with terrorist pasts, but I don't want to pay taxes to subsidise folks associated with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Call me eccentric, but there you go. But my final argument, in my remaining 60 seconds, is that in all my life in Asia, I've never ever met a single national leader at any stage of development who has said to me, when I say, what are the important things for the development of your country, who says aid. None of them. Not Lee Kuan Yew, not Manmohan Singh, not any of the Chinese. When the Indians embarked on their economic development program, it was because they were having a foreign currency crisis. If there had been aid to bail them out, they would have never embarked on their economic reform and lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. My final reflection is that in my life, I have believed all my life in three institutions: the Catholic Church, the Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs and News Limited. Two of those institutions, and I won't mention which they are, could do with a bit of aid at the moment. So if you have any spare, I could nominate where it might go. Thank you.
Martin Thomas.
Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a lucky country. When fate threw you on life's stage in Australia, rather than Niger or Afghanistan or Somalia, you benefited enormously. It's kind of like a lottery of latitude, that the luck of where you were born determines how you'll live. And there's lots of examples of this. For instance, in Australia, you probably had the chance to be born in a hospital. We know from statistics that less than 1 in 2 people in poorer countries get to even see a healthcare worker when they give birth. A smaller fraction than that ever see a hospital. And it's not a hospital that we'd understand. I know there's a birthing clinic in PNG where you can go down to the shore and it's so close to Australia you can actually see islands that are Australian territory. And it's a birthing clinic without any running water. So women who already are forced to walk several miles or for hours on end in labour are also asked to carry 2 buckets of water to assist with their birth. It's perhaps not surprising that 250,000 mothers die in childbirth. And there are other privileges by being born in Australia. In your first 5 years of life, you probably had enough to eat. You probably had access to healthcare. And yet each year, some 8 million children die before the age of 5 because of hunger, because of poverty, because of preventative or diseases that are easily preventative. In some communities, the death rate is so bad that they don't even bother to name the child in the first 12 months. It's just too risky. Too many children die. They wait until the child reaches 12 months before they even give them a name. Growing up, you probably lived in a house that had electricity, a house that had running water, a house that had a toilet. Here's something to consider. Something like 2.5 billion people don't have access to adequate sanitation, which is something to think about next time you flush. And you probably had the opportunity to go to school, and yet 100 million children of school age don't get that same opportunity. So it's this lack of latitude that has provided us with some amazing privileges. And I think we know that in Australia we do live in a world of plenty, and I think many of us are also aware of poverty in our world. And this contradiction is never more mind-boggling than when you think the world spends 3 times the amount of money it does on diet products and services than it does on the total foreign aid. So don't worry about the $5 trillion that Greg alluded to in terms of the amount of aid. 400 billion on weight loss and about 130 billion in complete total in terms of foreign aid. Now these statistics, and I know there's been a lot of them, I sound like I've swallowed a calculator, my apologies, but these statistics do make us feel uncomfortable. They make us feel guilty, and they make us want to believe that you just can't do anything to change global poverty. It makes us want to believe that the instances of corruption, of mismanagement, sometimes when they're the exception rather than the norm, that these instances just highlight how it's such an impossible job. We've done our very best, and there's no way of helping these people. There's no way of making a difference, so we might as well not bother, and we might as well just not think about it. But at the risk of sounding like a preacher tonight, I have good news. And the good news is this: you can be released from despair, guilt, and this feeling of being defeated, because the good news is aid works. Aid that is aimed at reducing poverty works. Aid is also affordable. And finally, when we look at the war on poverty, when we look at the number of kids that are dying and the number of kids that were dying previously, we are winning the war on poverty. So this message does also come with a health warning. We're not pretending that aid will take the place of better trade outcomes, so fair trade, debt forgiveness, a deal on climate change, perhaps moves to stop speculators that push up the price of food. For us, spikes in food probably add $1 or so to a loaf of bread. For someone that's spending 60-70% of their income on food, these price shocks are the difference between eating and not eating. So it's not going to replace those things. Those things will be great in terms of having outcomes for the poor if we ever achieve them, but aid still has a role in reaching the very poorest. So it is a case of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or in this case, 8 million babies. So, aid works. I'm going to go into more statistics, so brace yourself. Since 1990, the number of children dying because of poverty before they reach their 5th birthday was 12 million. So every year, 12 million children die of preventable diseases. A few years ago, which is the latest time we have for these stats, that figure was slashed to 8 million. It's still a terrible figure, but what we know is that there is 12,000 fewer children dying each day, 12,000 fewer each day than in 1990. And the reason for this is largely due to aid. It is 3 basic, effective, cheap interventions. We've managed to provide these kids with vaccinations, with vitamin supplements, and with mosquito nets. So if there's nothing that you remember about my speech all night, remember 3 simple interventions have caused the number of kids that are dying needlessly to plummet. Now, aid works, And I could tell you about other achievements of aid. I could talk about the end of smallpox and the near end of polio. I could tell you about how aid has turned around the epidemic in terms of AIDS, TB and malaria, particularly cutting new infections. And also I could tell you about education, making it available to millions more children, particularly girls. But I don't have time to go into more detail. Luckily, I have a stunningly talented and good-looking team tonight on the negative side. And Samar is going to look at just how misunderstood our aid budget is. She's going to highlight some of the remarkable successes of aid. She's going to tackle the issue of corruption. And she's going to stress the importance of aid as part of a holistic response to fighting poverty. Andrew will show you the difference between bad aid and good aid. He's going to convince you that good aid, just like good trade and investment policies and practices, all play a role in ending extreme poverty. So we've talked about aid, we've talked about aid working, we've talked about it being affordable. I mean, how much do you think we spend? How much does the Australian government spend on aid? We've heard a lot of figures bandied about, but would it be, say, 10% of our overall wealth? Would it be 5%? Perhaps 1%? So we spend 0.35% of our gross national income on our overseas aid program. So about 35 cents for every $100 in wealth. And it is quite appealing to hear Greg saying we should beef up DFAT and our diplomatic posts and perhaps even our military, but surely as a country we can afford 35 cents out of 100. And perhaps we could even go a little bit more and go 50 cents out of 100, which is what we committed to in the UN. So we spend so little on aid, and yet it does achieve so much. You'll hear a lot from the Affirmative team tonight talking about bad aid. But we're going to convince you tonight that there is such a thing as good aid. And good aid is both effective and affordable in saving lives and transforming lives. And I believe we have a moral responsibility to give aid. It works, we can afford it, and our humanity should not end at our national borders. When a mother loses a child, do we really think that her devastation is any less because she's not an Australian mother? Do we believe that a child doesn't deserve the same hopes and dreams of getting an education simply because of where they're born? I've been firsthand, I've seen people with no food. I've spoken to parents who have seen kids die from preventable diseases, and trust me, their tears are just as the same tears as ours, and their pain is just as deeply felt. So aid, when used effectively, good aid, is most certainly not a waste of money. Thank you.
James Goodman.
Thank you. We're told that, we've heard that aid helps overcome poverty, does it? It doesn't address the causes of poverty, and in fact, makes matters worse. What are the main causes of poverty today? First, debt. Debt is a key cause. It drains the public finances and can never be repaid. $3.5 trillion, $600 billion a year in debt in interest payments being repaid. Secondly, the cost of food. Since 2000, the cost of food has doubled, and world hunger is on the rise, reversing many of the gains that have been made over the last 20 years. Third, climate change. Floods, storms, droughts, fires, seawater inundation are attacking basic livelihood. It's said that 20 households a day are being displaced in Bangladesh due to rising seawater. The World Bank puts the cost at $100 billion a year already. 3 causes of poverty: debt, food, climate. People call this the triple crisis for development. The UN says that these 3 factors are reversing development for the majority of the world's people. Can aid help? First, let's look at debt. Countries need to borrow to finance development, but on what terms? Much of the $3.5 trillion in developing country debt has been owed for 30 years and has grown due to debt scheduling, where interest is paid on unpaid interest. Many of the debts were taken out in the era of cheap money in the 70s, only to be rescheduled with higher interest rates in the 80s. The parallel is with the subprime mortgagees. in the US who took out low, affordable mortgages and then were faced with rising interest rates after some years. The key difference, of course, is that the subprime mortgagees in the United States could go bankrupt. Countries generally can't. Although one exception, it's worth mentioning, Argentina did default about 10 years ago and was widely predicted to be a basket case, to become a basket case. But in fact, free of debt, it has prospered. Banks in the West, of course, lent a great deal of money to dictators, to Marcos, Suharto, and so on. The democratic governments that replaced those regimes now have to repay those debts. In '96, rich countries recognized some debt would never be repaid, but after 15 years, we've only seen $1 billion written off. The remaining debt just keeps rising. So has aid helped debt relief? In the desire to inflate the aid budget, governments like Australia, like the Australian government, have counted debt relief as aid. This sounds eminently sensible, but it means that loans to dictators are counted as development aid, corrupting the aid budget. Australia is a case in point. When Australia invaded Iraq in 2003, it cancelled the debts of Saddam Hussein's. Debts that had been owed to the Australian Wheat Board, partly for wheat contracts that, as we heard later, of course, were won through bribes in contravention of the UN sanctions on Iraq. So the aid budget helped to mop up the mess created by the Australian Wheat Board. But much more fundamentally, aid helps to deepen the debt crisis. The Australian aid budget provides funds for international agencies like the World Bank that lend money to developing countries. The money is used for projects that fit the World Bank's agenda, not necessarily the developing country's needs. And when the project fails, guess what? The country is left with the debt. And aid is increasingly linked now with public-private partnerships and to export credit guarantees. In fact, it's said that up to half of the unpaid debt arises from these kind of loans, where essentially the developing country bears all the risk for the private investor in their country. So aid is not the solution to debt, it's actually part of the problem. So let's turn now to food, the second crisis. Most of the world's food is produced in developing countries, about 2/3 actually. In these countries, the food is grown by smallholders on plots of land of less than 10 acres. That's 80% of developing country food is produced by these smallholders. Food prices are rising because food production in developing countries is not increasing. In fact, there is an exodus from the land in many of these countries as farmers are no longer able to make a living. One of the key reasons for this is the World Trade Organization, which in 1994 extended trade rules to agriculture, extended free trade rules to agriculture. Many people believe that free trade would benefit small farmers. In fact, it's enriched agribusiness and decimated farming through import surges in times of glut. Many developing countries have become dependent upon food imports. Indonesia, for instance, has become dependent upon rice imports. Meanwhile, 100 agribusiness companies now control 40% of the world's food supply. And I'll just stop. I know that's yet another figure for you, but 100 companies now control 40% of the world's food supply. Think of Woolworths and Coles in Australia and globalise it. On top of the free trade agenda, we've seen a massive expansion in food speculation. In 2000, the US lifted its ban on food speculation. The ban actually, interestingly, dated back to the 1930s. Had been imposed after the Depression years. By 2008, $14 trillion was flowing into food commodities, grossly inflating the price of food. And with the financial crisis, food prices slumped and then rose again with a recovery, showing a direct relationship between the price of food and finance. Meanwhile, an additional 180 million people were added to the absolute poor, and the World Bank warned that the crisis endangered anti-poverty gains from the 1980s. So has aid helped to address the food crisis? Again, a resounding no. In fact, aid has been linked to the market access agenda of the World Trade Organization. We heard aid for trade offered to countries to help them realize the opportunities in the global marketplace. At least that's the rhetoric. In fact, of course, a cynic like myself would say much of that aid for trade was designed to help these countries sign up to trade agreements that were obviously not in their best interests. Aid may offer infrastructure to help governments increase food output, but often it's geared to cash cropping, making the countries more dependent on agribusiness and less able to feed themselves. And of course, aid does nothing to deal with the speculation crisis. Now, the third cause of global poverty: has aid helped to address climate change? Climate change is now reversing development across the planet. 9 out of 10 people displaced by climate change are in developing countries. The crisis is, of course, I have to say it, caused by greenhouse gas emissions, and the world's highest emitters, both in terms of historical emissions and emissions today, are directly responsible for the crisis. Obviously, these countries, which are most to blame for the problem, and also which have the most capacity to deal with emissions, have a moral obligation to act now to halt coal mining, to stop drilling for gas and drilling for oil, to stop the fossil fuel economy. The reality is that rich countries have not significantly reduced their greenhouse gas emissions, and in fact, several have embarked on a carbon boom. And I don't need to say much more about that. We all know, we're all aware of that, I'm sure. The rich countries owe a climate debt, a debt that is not being repaid, and meanwhile the impacts are getting worse. Aid cannot address the climate debt owed by rich countries, and in fact is being used to help rich countries avoid paying that debt. The World Bank now argues that the aid can provide climate proofing, so developing countries can adapt to climate change. This is obviously nonsensical, but also dangerous, as it suggests we only need to adapt to the symptoms of climate change, not address its causes. Climate aid, much like aid for trade, is also used to persuade developing countries to sign up to unjust agreements. The Copenhagen Accord, clearly inadequate, opposed by the vast majority of countries, gained signatories mainly because countries needed to sign it in order to get access to the $10 billion a year that it offers, the carrot. So aid smooths the way for inadequate agreements, and worse, aid is being used to finance projects in developing countries that produce carbon credits. The Australian government has provided more than $200 million to support projects in Indonesia that will help Australia export the problem. In fact, Australia anticipates that half of Australia's emissions reductions will be achieved in this way. I'll finish there.
Sama Hadid.
Ladies and gentlemen, I will not try to challenge James because I know his colleagues will do that for him. If we accept that the situation of extreme poverty, of hard-working people stuck in broken systems is wrong, and that we are committed to doing something about it, then support for aid is crucial. It's a crucial part of a set of measures that help people escape poverty, that saves lives and helps ensure people can work their way out of poverty so that they don't need aid in the future. As Martin outlined, being born in Australia, we've won in the lottery of birth. But what if we hadn't? What if my family were from another country and community and lived in extreme poverty? As an infant, I would have faced potentially life-threatening health issues. If my community lacked basic water infrastructure, I would have been at risk of contracting diseases. I love learning, but my parents wouldn't have enough money to send me to school. Without basic numeracy and literacy skills, my ability to work would be limited. I'm a pretty hard worker, so I'd like to think that I'd gain and learn the skills to build something of my own. I'd want to start growing additional crops from my family's stock. But then I'd realise that without a bridge across the local river, I wouldn't be able to get to the market to sell them. And as a woman, my access to the market would be further restricted. I'd continue working hard and just get by. As I got older, I'd want to start a family. But living in a rural area, there probably wouldn't be any health carers to speak to during my pregnancy. And I may not be able to find a skilled birth attendant to help with my delivery. So I'd be at risk of becoming one of the hundreds of thousands of women who die each year from complications during pregnancy and childbirth. That absence of basic health services, education and infrastructure, a stifling possibility in more than 1.4 billion people. These are basic issues that our aid helps address. In just the past 4 years, Australia's aid has done things like vaccinate 900,000 children in Papua New Guinea, help 7 million children into schools in Afghanistan, support maternal and child health services for more than 27 million people in Bangladesh, and support transport infrastructure in Vanuatu. These are just a handful of success stories from aid programs that globally have saved more than 10 million lives in the past 10 years. I'd argue that these kinds of life-changing opportunities mean our aid program is an incredibly important investment area. We should call for improvements to the aid program wherever possible. But the important point is that we know that aid is helping write incredible success stories, helping hard-working people escape the cycle of poverty. It is a crucial component in a set of measures providing our world's most vulnerable with the opportunity to escape extreme poverty. It helps vulnerable communities deal with the impacts of natural disasters, of famine, and the unpredictable effects of climate change. It fosters trade, ensuring more literate and healthy population that can attract investment and participate in markets. It also contributes to good governance and reduces corruption, because an educated population means that they're able to better hold their governments to account. Aid helps create the crucial preconditions for communities escaping poverty. Put simply, it's like helping push-start a car. It's not a silver bullet, but there is no single solution to such a complex issue like ending poverty. Targeted, effective aid spending needs to be combined with things like trade, good governance, and debt forgiveness to ensure people born into broken systems will have the opportunity to escape extreme poverty. Measures like trade are important in helping lift economic conditions in poor communities. But trade cannot do the job of fighting poverty alone. To allow trade to happen, the world's poor need to be able to make investments into things like credit markets, infrastructure, and education. If we're going to alleviate, rather than exacerbate the suffering of the poor, trade markets also need to be fair and equitable, which isn't currently the case. We should always be calling for the most effective aid. Effective and good aid is about transparency and directing our aid dollars into long-term investments like health. It's about giving aid to multilaterals rather than governments. And I'm happy to report that Australian aid is already doing this. Effective and good aid can help people work their way out of extreme poverty so that they won't need aid in the future. In the short term, aid is one of the most important ways we can finance poverty eradication. And that aid can help kickstart economic development and better governance so that countries can graduate from aid. South Korea is an example of this. It's an example of a country transitioning from being an aid recipient to being an aid-giving country. It successfully entered into the trade system when it was ready to do so. And it was ready to do so because of aid assistance and investment in education. This is an example for the need of an educated population to kickstart economic growth, allowing people to work and trade their way out of extreme poverty. And I would agree with Greg, corruption is an issue, but it's a massively overstated problem and one that we should be working to tackle. But let's put this issue into context. In the past 4 years of Australia's aid program, corruption has affected just 0.017% of aid dollars. To use it as an excuse to remove support for the whole program is completely unreasonable. If our concern is the loss of money that is a result of corruption, then we should be talking about corporate tax dodging, which costs developing countries more than $160 billion, which is more than is given in aid and represents more of a problem than corrupt governments do. We should be addressing corruption, and we can do that by supporting the types of things we know make a difference, like education, something that aid supports. Australia's aid is improving literacy, investing in a generation who will be better equipped to hold their leaders to account, and improving governance and accountability, and delivery of services by working with governments and communities to ensure money is spent wisely. AusAid is now focusing on investing in multilateral institutions as opposed to directly giving to governments, which has prevented corrupt governments siphoning aid dollars. International aid has empowered poor and excluded people to stand up for their rights and fight corruption, including investing in independent auditing, community accountability and parliamentary structures, and even whistleblowing programs in Kenya, for instance. It's all part of a bigger solution. If we're committed to addressing the injustice of extreme poverty, then aid is a crucial investment. It pays for the things that are the preconditions to escaping poverty and allows people the chance to get a foot onto the ladder of development. And of course, saves lives. And that is why foreign aid is not a waste of money. Thank you.
Tim Wilson.
Well, thank you, Simon, and thank you all for making the trip out here tonight on a cold winter's evening. I want to say, firstly, how much I agreed and concur with the comments of Greg Sheridan, our first speaker, how much, despite what some people might be surprised, I actually agree with so many of the comments of the second speaker on our side. I actually thought they were incredibly valuable insights and couldn't agree more about the corrupting role that aid plays, particularly in international institutions, and to bully developing countries. My points are simple. Foreign aid isn't the best policy for promoting development. Foreign aid has many flaws. To promote development, we have to fix institutional problems in developing countries that are perpetuated by a top-down approach to development using foreign aid. Policies that remove restrictions on the poor lifting themselves out of poverty are better. I want to work from the bottom up, and this is a debate. So let's get some agreement. I think we can all agree we think sustainable economic development for the world's poor is a desirable objective. I'm not hearing opposition, so I'm going to take that as a given. We can also agree that we think that foreign aid isn't necessary for economic development. Now wait for it. We know this because some countries did organically develop without foreign aid. But what we are trying to do is speed up the process of development and tackle some development restraining challenges for those that have not developed using aid. Is that a general agreement as well? Yeah, all right, we're getting there. And we can all agree that the best thing for countries to develop is to found the institutions and structures of an open, liberal, capitalist economy and society. No, I didn't think I was going to get much agreement on that. To me, this is the real subject of tonight's debate. Foreign aid is a waste of money because there are better solutions to promote development. What I want to avoid is definitional debate. I'm defining foreign aid as taxpayer financing from one wealthy country toward development goals in a comparatively poorer country. Australia currently spends $5.2 billion annually on overseas development assistance. The objective is to get it to $7.5 billion if the opposing team has their way. Now, no hard data has been presented that the bipartisan goal of 0.5% of gross national income will help. Sadly, we've heard absurd claims like 200,000 people will die if we don't increase it in a speedy order. What's better, $5.2 billion spent on ineffective aid or $200 million on aid spent effectively? These numbers, including ratios to gross national income, mean nothing. They are just a benchmark for the aid industry to justify why we are not doing enough. There is no correlation to effectiveness, but I do applaud the enthusiasm to see more focus on effectiveness. Foreign aid can have a role, but most of it is a waste of money and a misallocation of resources for the donor and the recipient. One of the most essential flaws of foreign aid is that these priorities of the donor are paramount in how it's spent. But laws and program delivery is always best designed closest to those it's intended to serve. The further away a ruler is, the less likely they are to be able to understand the local conditions. There are still political and policy objectives the Australian government binds towards its aid expenditure and focuses on when it delivers the money. That's why Australia is increasingly and foolishly spending aid funding well outside the sphere of influence, particularly in Africa, rather than focusing on our sphere of influence in Southeast Asia. So with billions of euros flowing into Africa, why is Australia sending what's in the end piecemeal funding to Africa? It's, as Greg outlined, to buy Security Council votes. And it's not like we are alone. China is engaging in a very big campaign of chequebook diplomacy across the region. Giving money to international institutions also isn't necessarily getting good bang for our donation buck. They can finance industry development, but they also bind political agendas that plague domestic politics and impose stringent environmental and social regulations, all of which carry an economic cost that undermine countries exploiting their natural resources needed for development. In rich countries, we can afford to both pay those costs of environmental and social regulation, but we can also want to afford them because we can afford them ourselves. High costs shouldn't be imposed on poor countries using aid. There are also many other issues around foreign suppliers crowding out local economic development and many more. But the biggest problem is that despite billions of dollars on foreign aid, it has almost universally failed as a policy mechanism to promote development. No country on earth has foreign aided its way out of poverty. But hundreds of millions of people have traded their way out of poverty. Now, you're a smart audience. I don't need to go through the trade versus aid debate. But it should come as no surprise to anybody that according to the Index of Economic Freedom, the highest ranking countries of those that have the most economic freedom are also the wealthiest. And this is true across the world. Those that have the least economic freedom are the poorest. But you cannot even trade yourself out of poverty if there isn't the right institutional framework for a capitalist society. In his landmark book, The Mystery of Capital, Why Capitalism Triumphs in the West and Fails Everywhere Else, Peruvian development economist Hernando de Soto outlines the often forgot organic nature of economic development that we enjoyed. In short, we established a system of private property with titles that were enforced. Those titles were then used to leverage credit that enabled people to invest and harness potential of that property. As it still exists in much of the world, including in the developing world, private property titles don't exist, and therefore people cannot engage in a market economy and transactions and leverage the potential of their assets. Equally, it liberates people, particularly women, from wasting their lives spent protecting their property out of fear other people will occupy it. We also have a system of contracts that provides certainty for transactions that can be enforced with predictable courts. As a result, we can engage in transactions with each other with a degree of independence of adjudication. The same is not the case where contracts barely exist and they are not enforceable. As a result, people just engage in commercial relationships with people they trust, their close friends and family. In some cases, they may be the best person to do business with, but more often than not, it limits the economic opportunity and stops them accessing technology. But private property titles and enforceable contracts are not enough. Access to affordable credit is a very important part of economic development as well. It also still requires the institutions like fair and predictable courts, as well as government bureaucracy and a police force to avoid corruption. Much of this development has to come with cultural change within countries. Corruption is a cancer, and once people put into the system of corruption, it's in their interest to perpetuate it so they can take it out when it's their turn. Part of the problem, of course, with corruption is that it's actually reinforced by foreign aid because often the recipients of foreign aid are those in positions of power. The best way to achieve the objectives of poverty eradication is by taking a bottom-up approach. For rich countries delivering development through foreign aid, they often take the top-down approach. For rich countries, the bottom-up approach is using mechanisms to adopt policies that allow the unleashing of the potential, the maximum potential of the world's poor. The most obvious example is the use of migration as a development policy. Remittances, or the transfer of funds from developing country workers operating in developed countries, is a very important part of this. They send back around $440 billion annually, or nearly $500 billion, or apparently the same amount as the weight loss industry. It's a policy that's proven to work, yet development organisations spend 2/5 the sweet bugger all time talking about it, despite its enormous potential, because in part it cuts out their involvement and allows money to go directly to the people where it's best delivered. Importantly, remittances only come from employment opportunities that we in developed countries allow for those in developing countries. And for low-skilled migrants in low-skilled industries, it's extremely important, but we lock them out, largely because groups like the union movement don't want the low-cost labour competition, and it denies entrepreneurial people their opportunity. And they've been doing it for well over a century. That's the sustainable way to drive development, to give people opportunities, not to endorse foreign aid. Thank you.
Andrew Hewitt.
Well, as Tim helpfully reminded us, we're in a debate, and the debate is whether foreign aid is a waste of money. But what we've had from the affirmative side is examples of bad projects. And the reality is there are many examples of bad projects. But correspondingly, there are many good examples of good quality aid which is making a difference, has made a difference, and hopefully will continue to make a difference in poor people's lives right around the globe. What do we mean by bad aid? Bad aid, which I would categorise as being very much a waste of money. Essentially, bad aid is that aid which is motivated by the interests of the donor rather than that of people living in poverty. It frequently means tied aid, tying the aid to commercial interests of donor countries. It's frequently tied to security agendas. And to give you some examples of some current trends, since 2002, 1/3 of all development aid to the 48 states classified as fragile went to just 3 countries, Iraq, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Over the same period, aid to Iraq and Afghanistan has accounted for over 2/5 of the entire $178 billion global increase in aid provided by wealthy countries. And frequently, bad aid is tied to political agendas. And again, an example from the Australian aid program, that Afghanistan, which is not what I'd regard as being close to Australia's centre of interest, is now AusAid's 4th largest country program. So there are many examples, and anyone who is involved in the development debates can pull those examples out of bad quality programs. But there are many good quality programs and projects which are making a real difference in people's lives. What do I mean by good quality programs? Well, they're accountable. They're accountable to the people that they're supposed to benefit. They're owned by those people. The people directly affected by the project are in the driver's seat, implementing, shaping those programs. They're focused on the poorest, the most marginalised, particularly women, and see women as change makers, helping change their communities, change their societies. It strengthens the capacities of both of individuals and of organisations at a local community level and at a national level. And importantly, it strengthens the capacities of those communities and those individuals to hold their own governments accountable for delivery of basic services for the impacts of their decision. And importantly, it's an investment. It's not short-term measures. It's a long-term investment in people's futures and helping people find a pathway out of poverty. I've been privileged over the years to see firsthand the impacts of Oxfam's projects around the globe. At local levels, in the villages, in the slums, people are being supported to take greater control of their lives, to shape their futures. I'm privileged to see the role of women as change makers, of communities coming together. I know of programs which have boosted accountability and have that boosting of accountability at their core and seeing the practical differences that those sorts of programs make. Of community-based monitoring programs in Uganda, for example, which showed stark improvements in maternal and child health. Just last month I was in Delhi in India and in the slums in Delhi, the nation's capital, visiting one of our partner organisations, an organisation called JOSH, which is focusing on accessing the right to basic education, the constitutional right to education. It doesn't provide schools, it doesn't provide teachers, it mobilises parents, mostly mothers, to ensure that politicians, governments are held accountable for the delivery of the constitutional rights. So there's that micro level. People's lives are changed through good quality aid programs. People are getting greater control over their lives as a result of those sorts of programs. But there's also much in the way of macro understandings and assessment and analysis that points out at the global level, at the national level, aid is making a difference. Michael Clemens and his colleagues from a number of prominent universities in the recent editions of the Economic Journal, and I'll quote, said aid does cause modest positive increases in growth on average. Not everywhere, context is important. Good quality aid is critical to it. There was another paper from an organisation I don't often quote, the International Monetary Fund, and that looked at the impact on human development indicators and examined the impact of bilateral and international NGO aid. And they concluded, quote, NGO aid significantly reduces infant mortality, while bilateral aid does not. They suggested that this could be because NGO aid is more effective in reaching the poor, and that NGO aid is directed towards countries with high infant mortality rates. So to reiterate, good quality aid makes a difference. It makes a difference at the local level, makes a difference at the slums, makes a difference in the villages, and particularly in rural areas. But the statistics, the analysis shows it also makes that broader, bigger difference on a macro levels. My opponents have argued that there's a need for other policies, that there should be a greater emphasis on trade, on investment and on remittances. In many ways, I agree. But we've also got to take a full picture of those. Bad quality foreign direct investment, bad trade policies hurt people and hurt people seriously. Fair and equitable trade and investment policies and practices can help people living in poverty, but they shouldn't be counterposed to good quality aid. What do I mean by poor quality trade and investment policies? The rigged rules, the double standards of global trade policies play out day after day. The massive subsidies of European and American farmers result in overproduction, the dumping of surplus product on developing countries, markets, and crowd out competition from more competitive developing country producers. To give you an example, a European cow is subsidised to the tune of $2 a day. That's more than what 2 billion people live on, a third of the world's population. $3 billion worth of subsidies to 25,000 American cotton farmers had a devastating impact on cotton producers in places like West Africa. Much like we can hear the horror stories about aid, I'm giving you some horror stories about investment and trade. But good quality investment and trade, side by side with aid policies, really make a difference. So I argue quite strongly that good aid is necessary to achieve an end to poverty, but it's not sufficient. I think it's important for advocates for aid like myself to be humble and to be honest about aid's contribution. And as Tim has argued, even in dollar terms, it's dwarfed by remittances and dwarfed by private sector flows. But aid has got a role to play. It's got a role to play to really optimise the benefit of good trade and investment policies. It's got a role to play to help boosting the capacity of communities to respond to the shocks of climate change, of food price hikes, of economic crises, of humanitarian disasters. So aid is important, but it's not sufficient. Need that modesty about contribution, need to be clear about its standing vis-a-vis remittances and investment, but it also be clear that it's essential to create a world without poverty and without gross disparities of wealth and income. As I think our team have argued, and argued well, aid works, it makes a difference, and this can be seen at both micro and macro levels. But we need to accompany it by changes in government policies, changes in trade and investment regimes. Australia is hardly a profligate aid spender. Martin's demonstrated that quite clearly. We can afford to spend more on aid. We've got to make sure that it's good quality aid. And very clearly, highly agree with Greg that we need greater and greater scrutiny. But good quality aid, well funded, is the right thing to do. It's a mark of a civilised country. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've heard from our 6 speakers. You've heard arguments grounded in ethical considerations. You've heard statistics about what works and what doesn't work, distinctions between good aid and bad aid, good trade and bad trade, attempts by Tim Wilson to gain the assent of the other team just by a series of propositions. It's now your opportunity to speak in this debate. There's about 20 minutes available, maybe slightly more, for those of you who would like to speak for or against this proposition. You might want to make your own speech in support of the idea that aid is a waste of money, and you'll be given up to a minute to do so. You might want to speak against the motion. We might simply want to ask a question or pose some kind of comment. At the end of that process, I'll then be asking the panellists to sum up and to have you cast your votes. So we're speaking, first of all, for the motion. Okay, your name, and you've got a minute starting now.
My name is Cedric Saldana, and I'd just like to suggest about 50 years ago, in 1960, there were 4 countries at $250 per capita. Today, 3 of those countries are over $10,000 per capita. 1 is still under $1,000. That one is India, which has got billions and billions of aid from the international community. And only in the mid-1990s, when it opened up its policies, did it start growing. The other 3 are South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan. The reason why they grew, 2 basic reasons. One are policies, which were growth-oriented, trade-oriented policies on the one hand, and on the other hand, internal, accountable, strong leadership from government. Both of those were missing in India till the mid-1990s, late 1990s. India woke up at that time, and that's the time that they began developing. Aid has had a very minimal impact. Thank you.
Feel free to applaud. This gentleman saying he's with you. Yes, you can spend money on aid, but it's so much better if you do others. You want to speak against the motion? Yes?
I'm against the motion, but I've got a question I'd like the panel of against to answer. A couple of years ago, there was a young Rwandan author speaking at Writers' Week, and she was asked about aid and what she would like, and she said the thing she would like would be for the overseas agencies to leave Rwanda and get people from overseas to support the NGOs in that country, because overseas had increased rent values, they were paid large wages, and they had big cars travelling around the city, and I wondered if you would care to comment on that.
Okay, well, we'll hold that for a moment. So the question is, yes, aid might be, but surely international aid agencies are just expensive costs upon the people they're trying to help. Speaking for the motion, yes.
Sorry, Mandy McAvoy for the motion. I just wanted to put forward that the opposition or the opposite side were not really talking about how we want to see more transparency in the aid sector. I saw you very quickly write off that corruption is overrated or overstated, you might have said, and we're not seeing that at the level that really is there. I mean, firsthand I saw in Mali in West Africa in 2008 on my travels over there, multi-million-dollar water projects that I didn't realise until I travelled there that there were legislated superannuation monies from the EU to the aid sector there. And these projects just gave up. I mean, they didn't have the people to fix them, they didn't have the skills. So very much what Greg Sheridan was talking about, the book White Man's Burden is fantastic, and also by Dambisa Moyo, Dead Aid. We've created this culture of dependency, and I think transparency really needs to be much more prevalent because corruption is well and truly ingrained, and I hope that it will change in my generation. I hope that educated people are standing up for it, but I don't see a lot of faith in it.
Thank you. And to be fair, just before I go to the panel, does anybody want to speak against the motion? Yes, over here, still at this microphone. Yeah.
My name is John Anthony Paul Patterson. I support strategic foreign aid as a vehicle to help the government meet its goals and priorities. Reasons for strategic aid can include a regional assistance mission in the South Pacific to process asylum seekers. Strategic foreign aid can also help the government win the required number of votes to win a seat on the United Nations Security Council for 2013-2014 and the network this seat will provide. My question is strategic aid a waste of money?
Okay, well, thank you. Let me start with you on this side. I'm not sure who wants to comment about it. There's a question put to you about the cost of international aid agencies compared to domestic groups, and also perhaps to you, Samar, that you seem too quick to dismiss corruption as a serious concern. So maybe we'll start with you on corruption.
I think corruption is certainly a problem, and a problem that needs to be tackled, and I think that we need to look at the solutions, but also remember that corruption is about bad practices and the lack of transparency that affects the poor. And the solutions that I put forward in relation to aid are driven by the poor communities, by holding their governments to account. And the way aid is being channeled through our AusAid budget and our AusAid program is trying to avoid that sort of corruption from taking place. So we are more often investing in multilateral institutions as opposed to bilateral agreements or directly funding governments that may fall into the trap of being corrupt. But I think that there are a variety of other solutions, including transparency of the extractive industries and ensuring that companies that are working in developing countries are transparent about their activities as well. We also need to look at it from the perspective of tax evasion. The statistic I gave was that $160 billion is lost from developing countries because of tax secrecy. So I think that we need to look at it in a holistic way, and there are a variety of solutions to tackling this problem.
Greg, you raised the issue of corruption in the first instance, saying that while corruption exists, even in a country you love as deeply as Indonesia, this was a waste of money. So do you find Samar's response to this convincing?
Not really. I think Samar's comment about transparency by mining industries, a lot of aid groups, I think they are generally good-hearted people, but a lot of aid groups are not empowering local communities. They're taking sides in domestic political debates which they have no business in. And there is an enormous bias in the aid industry against mining, for example. They hate mines everywhere, yet nothing contributes more to government revenue than the development of mines. Now, for AusAid, for example, to tell us that 0.0007% of the money it spends gets wasted in corruption, well, this is a government that can't put pink bats in ceilings correctly. How on earth can it monitor what happens to the corruption of money in aid recipient countries? And the final point on that is, if you give money to multilateral agencies instead of corrupt governments, that doesn't stop the money from being used corruptly, because the multilateral agencies then give the money to corrupt governments.
Andrew, you don't seem to hate mining because you've been involved with BHP Billiton, I know. So we'll rule that one out. But what about the notion that you're just driving up prices and that your international agencies are bad for the countries every time they turn up?
Well, that can be a reality, and I don't think there'll be any dispute of it. And I don't think we can see some of the potential for that with the withdrawal of United Nations forces in Timor in the coming next year or so. What I think it talks to is the importance of supporting local community organisations, supporting activity at a local level, getting that degree of ownership, getting people to own and drive and implement the programs at a local level. That's the way you are less likely to have international people driving around in the Land Cruisers. There are going to be sometimes that's going to be essential, but and that's the best way to support people at a local level. But I think ally that, support the people at local community level, ally that with a strong focus on transparency and an openness to being held accountable, I think is the way ahead. The mining industry, I think, can be a positive force for social development. But what's critical there is for the local communities to have the capacity to hold the mining company accountable for governments to set up a proper regulatory environment, and for revenue transparency to be absolutely central to what the mining company is doing.
Tim Wilson, strategic aid, surely that's not a waste of money. If a country, against what's been said here, was to think in a self-interested way and spend its dollars for its own interest, isn't that just realpolitik in international affairs?
Well, that's exactly it. Define strategic, and strategic to whom. Democratic governments rightly decide to invest or spend aid as they see appropriate in a country's national interest. Now, what they define as strategic at any given time can vary based on their policy priorities, but doesn't necessarily achieve
some seats on the Security Council.
Well, yeah, but I don't see that. Personally, I don't see that as a useful strategic outcome in the first place. Now, that might be a difference between me and the current government, but is that actually going to achieve the best outcome for poverty alleviation if that's what the focus of strategic aid is? This is the fundamental problem. We talk about corruption at the end of spending of foreign aid, but by its nature, government as an institution is almost essentially corrupt. It's corrupt from the outset as well. And so our domestic government has its own policy priorities that are driving its agenda for its allocation of resources. So I question the very legitimacy of the question.
What if the aim is not to alleviate poverty, but to secure influence in an area which is important? Or, and the figure was quoted about Afghanistan, to make a smoother path for soldiers who are engaged in combat there, or whatever. Are you going to rule? Would that be a useful use of money in your view?
Well, I will make this clear. I wouldn't consider that to be aid. That is national policy using dollars to purchase a particular outcome. And one of the things I made clear, or tried to make clear in my speech, was when I talk about foreign aid, I talk about long-term or medium-term commitments from government to help other countries out of economic development. I didn't consider disaster relief to be the case, and I wouldn't consider the example you just gave to be foreign aid, strategic foreign aid either.
Okay, so two speakers from the floor, and then we'll come back to the panel. Either of you want to speak for the motion? Yes? Okay, you'll go first.
Yeah, hi, Josh Madgwick for the motion, and yeah, I'm as surprised as anyone to find myself agreeing with Greg Sheridan and Tim Wilson, but the question as a comment, I guess, that I wanted to pose was, which has kind of just been covered while I've been standing here, but what is the purpose of aid? That hasn't really been necessarily covered by either side in a lot of detail, and if the purpose of aid is poverty alleviation, I think that it's been fairly clearly demonstrated that it has failed. And if you suggest perhaps another purpose, raising the standard of living in the short term, that might be able to be proven. But I think if we can decide that poverty alleviation is the purpose of aid, then I think that aid is a waste of money.
Okay, thank you. And speaking against the motion, your minute begins now.
I came a little late, so unless I missed it, microfinance hasn't been discussed this evening. And we know from work in the field that microfinance is most effective when it's directed towards women. And I'm wondering on your thoughts, given the fact that we realise that the empowerment of women is now understood to be one of the greatest drivers of economic growth this century. And so we also know that the UN understands violence against women to be one of the most pervasive and systematic human rights abuses in the world. So this, by nature, holds back women in their ability to drive growth within their communities. So I'm wondering your thoughts as to how we can, in the field, perhaps beyond the debate of aid, look at how do we really empower women in terms of directing money towards ending violence against women programs, microfinance, and allowing them to become advocates in change in a way that deals with issues that are, when we're talking about issues that hold back women's growth, that realise they're not cultural but criminal, and looking at that as one of the great drivers of economic growth that's set to be seen this century.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to ask the panel to answer two direct questions, then I'm going to start moving to the summing up, at which time the ballot boxes will be coming around and you'll be given the opportunity to cast your vote. Remember, if you've got your ballot paper and you're still undecided, leave it joined together. If you've been convinced by the for side, then tear and put in for or against. But that's going to come in a moment. It's a minute or so away. Martin, a couple of questions. One to do with what is the purpose of aid. But also, I'd rather like to hear you somebody on your side answered James Goodman's points. He said there were 3 causes of poverty: debt, climate, and what was the third one? Food. And that aid doesn't do anything about addressing those. So, but first of all, what is the purpose of aid?
So I guess when we look across, say, the 50-year history of aid, I think it's true that not a lot of aid has actually been focused on poverty reduction. We've had a Cold War in which aid was used as a tool of diplomacy. But I think if we do define it as poverty reduction, of actually going to the poorest of the poor rather than to, say, countries, if we can find a way to get them, what is actually a miracle is that the amount of aid that does reach people has actually had such a great result in terms of saving lives. So I think globally, I think our aid program currently is not too bad, and the independent review of aid did talk about focusing on people rather than countries and having a poverty reduction strategy and focus, and I think that's the way it should be. But I think you're right, over 50 years aid's been used and abused under all sorts of titles, and the miracle is the reduction in kids that are dying, people living in poverty, the fact that it's actually done such a good thing with such a small percentage being used properly.
So it's about relieving poverty, but what do you say to James? I mean, the 3 causes: debt, food.
Look, I find myself agreeing with a lot of what they're saying on the other side of the table, which is a bit of a conundrum. But I think, look, certainly, it's not an and/or equation. We certainly on this side of the table, I can speak in cathedra for my partners here. If we had a fairer trade outcome, if we had fairer policy, if we had a climate change resolution, which doesn't seem close anytime soon, all those things will have a greater impact on economies and people that are poor, but there will still always be a role to reach down. I think when economies grow, the rising tide doesn't reach all people. People are left out, and that's what aid can do.
Okay. And James, aid surely, with its impact on women through education, there must be a good case for where it is actually worth spending. Did you agree with that comment?
No. Aid is a gift. It always empowers the giver, by definition. I take the point that there's good and there's degrees of badness in aid, good and bad aid, but ultimately you can't escape donor power. Only justice empowers. And what I was trying to suggest is that we should choose justice first, because injustice is what's causing the problem of global poverty. And that's what needs to be addressed if we're going to be able to do anything about it.
Okay, well look, I thought we might be going to get some kind of edging towards the middle with the kind of the olive branch that Martin was having, but it seems no. So you have a stark choice to make. Either aid is a waste of money because it's unjust, or it could be spent on better purposes, or it doesn't work. Or you think it's not a waste of money, that it does genuinely alleviate poverty and that there's enough good aid to warrant it. That's for you to decide by the way that you cast your vote. As the ballot boxes come around, are they ready to go? Yes? I'm going to ask each of the speakers to spend up to 2 minutes advancing a summary or picking up on some point that might have been there. Starting with Greg Sheridan, your 2 minutes begins now.
Well, Simon, I'd like to say I admire Martin for speaking ex cathedra, Petri. This is a temptation to which I often succumb myself, and I like to see it. It's something I'd like to encourage, and theological training has its purposes. I agree with Andrew about US and European agricultural subsidies, and I appreciate Andrew's honest contribution, and indeed I appreciate the fact that the aid lobby is well motivated and speaks up for poor people. I think that's a good thing. But I do disagree with a lot of the methods. I like strategic aid. I like aid to be in the interests of the donor as well as the recipient. Aid often has a security and an intelligence purpose. That's certainly true of Australia. We donate to Indonesian counter-terrorism efforts to save Australian lives as well as Indonesian lives, and to give us intelligence about what the Indonesians are doing. But my final point is this. The most rapid, hugest, most consequential exit from poverty in human history is the experience of East Asia over the last 50 years. Aid had absolutely nothing to do with it, absolutely nothing. I've never heard a South Korean say they graduated from aid. A South Korean would shoot you if you said that their development was a consequence of any aid they received. Now, I do think there are circumstances in which aid is justified. I don't want to abolish all aid, but I think an enormous amount of it is a waste of money. Many multilateral agencies are like UNRWA, the UN agency for the Palestinians, are notorious boondoggles of corruption and waste and madness, and I don't think Australian taxpayers should be forced to subsidise them.
Thank you. Thank you. Martin Thomas.
Yeah, just when you feel like you're agreeing with the other side, then it all goes terribly wrong at times. Look, I do find myself agreeing with James, as I said. I believe we need much better outcomes. This is not an either-or. There are things that will bring millions of people out of poverty that aren't to do with aid, but aid does have a role. I even agree with Greg, well, particularly on he doesn't believe we should abolish all aid. I certainly agree with that. But we must do more to make sure we guard against corruption and we increase transparency. Luckily, I disagree almost with every single thing Tim said tonight. Look, I don't think it's a trade versus aid debate. I think we're not really talking about economies. While economies grow, I think Jeffrey Sachs talked about aid has a role in trying to get people to the bottom rung of the economic ladder so they can participate. Because what we've seen with economies, particularly in Asia, which have grown fast, there are a sector of the population that are left behind, that can't participate, that can't benefit. Aid does have a role in reaching those people, providing the essentials. So I think, and in terms of the idea that we should press the pause button on the aid program till we get it right, it's a bit like when we see a problem in, say, one of our local hospitals, to say that we should close them all or close half of them until we get it absolutely right. I think we've got enough experience now to walk and chew gum and to get it right. And I think a lot of what we said over on our side in terms of taking the high moral ground, I think there is a really strong moral argument around looking to direct money effectively to those people that are in critical need. A much more intelligent man than me, Peter Singer, a Melbourne ethicist, talked in his book, The Life You Can Save, and he gives the example of walking along and you see a child drowning in a lake, and it's not your child. You may be busy, it may have a cost in going in and rescuing that child, you may just have new shoes, but at the end of the day, he says, pretty much every one of us would go in and rescue that child from drowning. He then says, what's the difference of a moral obligation just because they live overseas?
Thank you. And you're laying a charge of ethical failure against the other side then, I take it. James?
In terms of pursuing justice rather than aid, I think we have to be aware what the underlying problem is that we face. Why isn't the debt cancelled? Why is there no ban on speculation? Why are rich countries not paying their climate debt? And I think the reason for this is global inequality, the fact that the levers of power are in the main controlled by 70 million people in this world, 70 million people in this world who own half of the planet's wealth. This is the 1% that call the shots, that ensure this injustice continues. Meanwhile, 50% of the world's population, 3.5 billion people, own just 1%. That is the problem that we face. The problem of global inequality that means we don't do anything about the injustices and means that global poverty continues. And I just wanted to say one thing. The Palestinian agencies have been mentioned a couple of times, and I don't entirely agree with the position that my co-panelists have taken on this. The Palestinians people form the largest group of displaced people on the planet now. And they, of course, have been displaced for many decades. Now, the problem, the injustice that the Palestinian people face has to be addressed, not through aid, of course, in my view, but actually by a substantial change in the situation in Israel-Palestine. Again, that's an issue that should be addressed through justice and not through aid. So.
Thank you, James. Just so I'm clear on your position, is it that you would discontinue aid, say, to the Palestinians as a first step, prior to the issues of justice being resolved?
I think that, the position that I would take would be that the situation on the ground has to be addressed in the first instance. I mean, aid is of marginal relevance to that conflict, and the key thing is that there be change on the ground. I'm not going to sit here and say that aid to Palestinian organisations should be ceased. That's all.
As a general proposition, I was trying to understand, is that you would rather discontinue aid in advance of justice, or are you happy to support aid being provided while justice is progressively being addressed?
Unfortunately, I think aid perpetuates injustice. Many of the examples, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Samar Hadid.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is not an either-or argument. Ending poverty, ending extreme poverty, requires a holistic approach, requires a series of solutions, and aid is a crucial part of that. The foreign aid system is not perfect. No system is perfect. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's not downplay the role of aid and the assistance and the role that it plays for the world's most vulnerable. At its essence, extreme poverty is about not having control over your life, not being able to make things happen. As you sit at the moment, consider this. You're at the prime of your life, working hard, making $2 a day. It's not enough, but it's enough to get by. And then suddenly something happens. You get sick. You can't continue working. You can't provide for your family and your children. What happens? Aid plays a role here because it's the intervention that provides the preconditions that allows people to escape poverty. It's not the only solution, but it's certainly part of the solution. We've heard tonight that aid is affordable, aid works, aid is part of the solution along with good governance, along with fair trade. And most certainly, I think aid is not a waste of money.
Tim Wilson.
Well, firstly, I want to endorse every single comment that was made against protectionism and vested interests using the power of government to advance interests like in the agriculture sector in Europe and the United States. People around the world die because of these awful policies, but the response isn't fair trade. The response is free trade, because that isn't free trade. And, basically when it comes down to it, aid is being given to domestic interests in place like the United States and the European Union to promote their interests. This is the nature of what happens when you use words like fair. It means that they are amorphous and depend on who people decide should be the beneficiaries at the time. The only other comment I want to make, and I want to reiterate, is my strong view about the need to allow for migration into our country and other rich countries to enable poor people to lift them out of poverty and send money back home. We know this works. We know that when workers go back to their home countries, they bring back with them skills and opportunities to develop their own businesses and become their own entrepreneurs and develop a private economy which enables them to prosper and eventually to employ other people and develop sustainable economic development in those countries. And what I don't understand is why the aid industry doesn't talk about migration and the important contribution it can make to ensuring that the world's poorest can lift themselves out of poverty sustainably when it works so effectively. And if you want a simple metric on this, the word immigration appears on Oxfam's website 52 times. The word aid appears 1,750. World Vision 43 versus 2,740. Global Poverty Project 5 versus 1,980. Thank you.
Did you manually count those ones?
Google is a wonderful aggregator where it tells you at the top.
Andrew Hewitt.
Okay, look, I want a just world without poverty. I can't oppose the achievement of justice with trying to end poverty. I see the two tasks being very much interrelated. I think good quality development assistance is part of the way, a necessary part, but not a sufficient part of the way of trying to achieve that just world without poverty. James talked about three causes of poverty, of climate change, of the food price situation, food injustice and debt. We could have many other causes of poverty. I would put unaccountable governments as being one of the prime means that people are maintained in poverty. Building the capacity of individuals and organisations and communities to hold governments accountable, which is at the heart of much good quality development assistance, really is a way of getting at the heart of beating poverty and of achieving a more just world. So that's why I think we need to defeat the motion before the House. That's why we need to really recognise that foreign aid is part of the answer, and it's quite clearly not a waste of money.
Well, in a moment we'll know how you voted and how this matter's been resolved here tonight in Melbourne. But before we do, let me thank a few people. Our partners here in Melbourne, the Wheeler Centre, the staff and management of the Town Hall, the volunteers who've conducted the ballot, where we'll get the results in a moment, the editor and management of The Age, our media partner, the Mayor, Aldermen and officers of the City of Melbourne, and of course our supporters AMP. But before we give you the results, whatever the result might be, would you join with me in thanking our speakers tonight? Greg Sheridan, James Goodman, Tim Wilson, Martin Thomas, Summer Hadid and Andrew Hewitt. Well, as you know, there was a pre-poll taken before the debate, and the results for that were as follows. For the motion, 9.9% when people came in. So you didn't have a lot of friends in the audience. Against the motion, 67.2%, but a pretty big number of 22.9% were undecided. Now, when I give you the final results, of course, you might say we decide this based on the absolute numbers of for or against, or you might think that it's based on the size of the move. But here are the results at the end. So don't know dropped down to 12.7%. For the motion went up to 26.9%, but winning the debate with a margin, significant margin, with 60.4%. The against motion have won the motion tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for your involvement. The next debate here is on the 25th of September, and the topic is that Western civilisation is in terminal decline. So make sure you join us for that provocative and what we hope is an entertaining debate. But finally, can I thank all of you for your support, and I declare the debate to be closed. Thank you.